The harsh morning sun had barely crested the dusty horizon when Faith Sullivan discovered that life could indeed get worse, even when she believed she'd already suffered more than any woman should bear. She stood on the porch of her small ranch house, staring at the smoldering remains of her barn, clutching a letter announcing the bank's intention to foreclose on her property within 30 days. Montana Territory, 1878. 2 years a widow, and now this. Faith folded the letter with trembling fingers and tucked it into the pocket of her worn apron. At 32, she felt ancient, used up by grief and endless work. Thomas had been gone for 2 years, taken by a sudden fever that swept through their small settlement near Broken Creek. She'd buried him beneath the cottonwood tree where they'd once picnicked as newlyweds, full of dreams for their future. Those dreams had died with him, leaving her with a struggling cattle ranch, dwindling finances, and a reflection in the mirror she hardly recognized anymore. The vibrant young woman who'd come west as a bride had been replaced by someone with weary eyes and premature lines etched around her mouth. Faith sighed, pushing a strand of auburn hair back under her bonnet. The barn fire had destroyed her winter hay stores and damaged the corral. Without those repairs, she couldn't hope to keep the cattle contained come winter, let alone have enough feed to sustain them. The bank's letter made it clear they had little faith in a woman's ability to run a ranch. They wanted their money, and they meant to have it, one way or another. "Mrs. Sullivan?" The voice startled her. Faith turned to find a tall man sitting atop a magnificent chestnut stallion at the edge of her property. His broad shoulders were silhouetted against the morning sky, and the brim of his hat shaded his features. "Who's asking?" She kept her voice steady, though her hand drifted to the pocket where she kept Thomas's old derringer. "Garrett Hayes, madam." He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. As he approached, she noted his worn leather chaps, the faded blue of his shirt, and the quiet confidence in his stride. "I heard about your troubles and thought I might offer my services." Faith stiffened. "My troubles?" "The fire." He gestured toward the smoldering barn. "Word travels fast, even in these parts." He removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, a clear, startling blue, held a kindness that caught her off guard. "I'm not hiring, Mr. Hayes." Faith crossed her arms. "I can't afford help. I'm not asking for much, madam. Just meals and a place to bed down." He glanced at the charred remains of her barn. "I'm handy with tools, good with cattle, and I've got no pressing engagements elsewhere." Faith studied him, suspicion warring with desperation. Men didn't offer help for nothing, especially not to a woman alone. Thomas had taught her to be wary. But the bank's letter in her pocket felt heavy as lead. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. His smile revealed a small dimple in his right cheek. "I've been on the receiving end of kindness when I needed it most. Seems only right to pass it along." He shrugged. "Besides, I've been riding too long. Could use a few weeks in one place." Faith hesitated. Taking in a strange man went against every rule of prudence, but turning away help she desperately needed seemed equally foolish. 3 weeks, she said finally. "I can give you meals and the room above the kitchen. But I can't pay wages until after I sell some cattle." "Fair enough." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was callous but warm against hers, the grip firm yet careful. "The cattle need moving to the north pasture," she said, withdrawing her hand. "The one with the stream. After that, the barn needs clearing so we can salvage what lumber we can." Garrett nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll see to the cattle first, then. You got any hands to help?" "Just me," she said simply. "My husband died 2 years ago. The last hired man left 6 months back when I couldn't pay his wages." Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, which she would have resented, but understanding. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Sullivan." "Faith," she said. "If you're staying, you might as well use my given name." "Faith," he repeated, his voice warming the word somehow. It suits you. She looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. Supper's at 6, Mr. Hayes. Garrett, he corrected gently. Garrett, she acknowledged. Don't be late. She turned and went back into the house, aware of his gaze on her back. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow herself to breathe deeply, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake or found an unexpected blessing. Faith spent the day in a flurry of activity, partly to keep her mind off the stranger now working her land. Through the kitchen window, she caught glimpses of him driving the cattle toward the north pasture, his movements efficient and practiced. By mid-afternoon, he had begun clearing debris from the barn, working methodically through the charred timbers. When 6 o'clock approached, Faith found herself changing her dress and pinning her hair more carefully than she had in months. She caught herself in this act of vanity, and frowned at her reflection. What did it matter how she looked? This was a business arrangement, nothing more. Garrett arrived precisely at 6, having washed up at the pump outside. His hair was damp, his face clean-shaven, and his shirt, though worn, had been brushed free of dust. Something smells mighty fine, he said, removing his hat as he entered the kitchen. Just stew and biscuits, Faith replied, oddly flustered by his presence in her kitchen. Thomas had been a shorter man, narrower through the shoulders. Garrett seemed to fill the space in a way that made the familiar room feel suddenly different. A hot meal is a luxury when you've been on the trail as long as I have. He hung his hat on a peg by the door, the same peg where Thomas had hung his. The sight gave Faith a strange pang. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Garrett had a calm presence that didn't demand conversation. He ate heartily, complimenting her cooking with genuine appreciation. Where are you from originally? She asked finally, as she poured coffee. Missouri originally. Grew up on a farm near Springfield. He wrapped his hands around the mug. Left when I was 17. Been moving ever since. That's a long time wandering. He nodded. War came. Then after, it seemed easier to keep moving than to go back to what wasn't there anymore. The war between the states. Faith calculated quickly he must be in his 40s then. Older than she first thought, though he carried his years well. You lost family? She asked carefully. Parents. Brother. Farm. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. You. Parents died when I was young. Raised by my aunt in Ohio. Faith found herself continuing, though she rarely spoke of her past. Met Thomas when he came east buying horses. I was 24, thought I'd never marry. He was kind, offered me a life of adventure. She smiled faintly at the memory. I'd never been west of the Mississippi. Everything seemed so vast when we first arrived. It still is, Garrett said softly. That's its beauty. Faith looked at him, really looked, and saw something in his eyes that resonated within her, a love for this wild country despite its hardships. Thomas had never quite felt that way. He'd battled the land, seeing it as something to be conquered rather than embraced. The next morning, Faith woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went outside to find Garrett already at work, salvaging usable lumber from the barn and stacking it neatly. You're an early riser, she observed, bringing him coffee. Old habits. He accepted the mug gratefully. Thought I'd get started before the heat sets in. Faith nodded, then hesitated. I need to ride into town today. The bank's expecting me. Garrett didn't ask questions, just nodded. Wagon need fixing before you go? No, it's sound. I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours. I'll keep things running here, he assured her. The ride into Broken Creek took just over an hour. Faith spent it rehearsing what she would say to Mr. Pemberton at the bank, trying to formulate arguments that might buy her more time. The town had grown since she'd first arrived as a bride 8 years ago. What had been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper main street with a hotel, general store, and even a millinery shop. The bank occupied a corner building with pretensions of grandeur. Columns flanked the entrance, though they were merely painted wood. Inside, the air was stuffy and smelled of ink and paper. Mr. Pemberton kept her waiting for nearly half an hour before deigning to see her. He was a thin man with spectacles that magnified his pale eyes, giving him the look of a perpetually startled owl. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, not rising when she entered his office. "I presume you're here about our notice." "Yes, Mr. Pemberton. I'm requesting an extension." Faith kept her voice steady. "As you may have heard, I've suffered a setback with the barn fire, but I have cattle ready to sell come the autumn drive." "Indeed." He adjusted his spectacles. "However, the bank has concerns about your ability to manage the property without adequate supervision." Faith felt her cheeks flush with anger. "I've run that ranch for 2 years since my husband's death, Mr. Pemberton. The only supervision I need is from the Almighty." "Be that as it may, a woman alone, I'm not alone," Faith said, the words coming before she'd fully formed the thought. "I've hired a foreman, Garrett Hayes. He's overseeing the rebuilding and will manage the cattle drive." Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "I see. This is recent?" "Yes," Faith admitted. "But Mr. Hayes is experienced. He'll ensure the ranch operates efficiently." Pemberton studied her for a long moment. "Very well. I will extend your deadline until after the autumn drive. But I expect full payment by November 1st, Mrs. Sullivan. No further extensions." Faith left the bank with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She'd bought time, but at the cost of a lie or at least an exaggeration. Garrett had agreed to 3 weeks of work, not to stay through the autumn drive. And certainly not to be her foreman. As she drove the wagon back toward home, Faith pondered how to approach him. She could offer a share of the profits instead of wages. It wasn't much of an enticement, but perhaps it would be enough. When she arrived home, she found Garrett had made remarkable progress. The damaged section of the barn had been completely cleared, and he had already begun framing a new wall. "You've been busy," she said, climbing down from the wagon. He wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Figured there's no point wasting daylight." Faith took a deep breath. "Garrett, I need to ask you something, and you have every right to refuse." He set down his hammer, giving her his full attention. "I told the banker you were my new foreman," she admitted. "That you'd be staying through the cattle drive in October." His expression remained neutral. "Why'd you tell him that?" "Because he was about to foreclose on my property. He doesn't believe a woman can run a ranch alone." The frustration she'd suppressed in Pemberton's office surfaced now. 8 years I've worked this land alongside Thomas, and 2 years on my own, but all they see is a helpless widow." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "What exactly are you asking me, Faith?" "Stay," she said simply. "Stay until the cattle drive. Help me get these animals to market and save my ranch. I can't pay much now, but I'll give you a percentage of the proceeds. You don't know anything about me," he pointed out. "I know you work hard. I know you're skilled with cattle. I know you could have robbed me blind last night, but instead you're rebuilding my barn." Faith met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." A slow smile spread across his face. "My pa used to say much the same thing." He considered for a moment. 20% of the cattle sales, after expenses." 15. Faith countered, relief flooding through her. 18, and I'll see to hiring 2 more hands for the drive. Can't move that many head with just the 2 of us." Faith extended her hand. "Deal." This time when their hands met, the contact lingered a moment longer than necessary. Faith found herself noticing the strength in his fingers, the warmth of his palm against hers. She withdrew quickly, flustered by her own reaction. "I'll start supper," she said, turning toward the house. "Faith," he called after her. When she looked back, he was watching her with those clear blue eyes. "You're doing just fine on your own. Pemberton's a fool if he can't see that." The simple vote of confidence warmed her more than it should have. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Garrett rose before dawn each day, tending to the cattle and continuing work on the barn. Faith managed the household, the vegetable garden, and the accounts. In the evenings, they shared meals and gradually, conversation flowed more easily between them. Garrett, she discovered, was well read despite his lack of formal education. He carried a battered copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass in his saddlebag, along with a Bible so well used its leather cover was smooth from handling. "My mother taught me my letters," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, the summer twilight stretching long across the land. "She believed education was the path to a better life." "She was right," Faith said, thinking of her own meager schooling. "Maybe. Though I've known educated fools and wise men who couldn't write their names." He smiled at some memory. "My father could barely sign his name, but he could read the weather, the land, the seasons better than any book learning could teach." "You miss them," Faith observed softly. "Every day." He looked out across the darkening land. "But less sharply now. Time does that, I suppose?" Faith thought of Thomas. The acute pain of his loss had indeed dulled, but lately she'd been troubled by how his face seemed less clear in her memory. Do you ever worry about forgetting them? How they looked sounded." Garrett considered this thoughtfully. "I think remembering the feeling of them matters more than recalling every detail. My mother's laugh, my father's hands, the essence of them stays with me." Faith nodded, comforted by the thought. "Thomas was quiet," she said after a moment. "Reserved, except when he was angry. He worked hard, had big dreams. He chose well, bringing you here," Garrett said. "Many women wouldn't have had your resilience." Faith laughed softly. "I didn't. Not at first. I cried for weeks after we arrived. Everything seemed so harsh, so empty." She gestured to the land stretching before them, bathed now in the deep blues of approaching night. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. This place. It becomes part of you." "That it does," Garrett agreed. "Gets in your blood." They sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared. Faith was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of soap and leather, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It had been so long since she'd simply sat with someone, sharing the quiet. Thomas had never been one for stillness. He'd always been planning, working, moving. There had been little time for watching stars or sharing thoughts. The following week brought a brief but violent storm that dropped hail the size of quail eggs. Faith and Garrett worked together to secure what they could, then took shelter in the house as the tempest raged. The newly framed section of barn held, much to their relief. "I think we're due a bit of luck," Faith said as they dried off in the kitchen. She handed Garrett a towel for his soaked hair. "Luck tends to favor the prepared," he replied, running the towel over his head. When he emerged, his hair stood up in endearing tufts that made him look younger, almost boyish. Faith laughed at the sight before she could stop herself. "What?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "Your hair," she managed, still chuckling. "You look like a startled rooster." He grinned fully then, and the transformation in his face was remarkable. The weathered lines eased, his eyes crinkled at the corners, and suddenly Faith could see the young man he must have been before life and war had shaped him. Without thinking, she reached up to smooth a particularly defiant tuft. Her fingers brushed against his temple, and she felt him go still beneath her touch. Faith froze, her hand suspended in the air between them. Thomas had been dead for 2 years, but in that moment, she felt acutely that she was betraying him somehow, not by the innocent touch itself, but by the flicker of awareness it had ignited within her. "I'm sorry," she murmured, dropping her hand. "I didn't mean to." "No need for apologies," Garrett said gently, though something in his eyes had changed, deepened. "It's been a long day. Perhaps we should turn in." Faith nodded, grateful for his tact. "Good night, then." "Good night, Faith." She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, unsettled by the encounter. It had been so long since she'd touched a man with any degree of familiarity. So long since she'd been touched in return. The simple contact had awakened sensations she'd thought dormant, reminding her that beneath her identity as a widow and a rancher, she was still a woman. That night, Faith dreamed of Thomas for the first time in months. In the dream, he stood at the edge of their property, looking toward the mountains. When she called to him, he turned and smiled, not his usual tight, controlled smile, but something warmer, more generous. "It's all right," he said in the dream. "You don't have to be alone." Faith woke with tears on her cheeks, feeling both bereft and strangely lightened. By early August, the barn was nearly complete. Garrett had done masterful work, and the new structure was actually an improvement on the original. He'd added better ventilation and a more efficient layout for storing hay and equipment. Word had spread about the new foreman at the Sullivan Ranch, and one afternoon, Faith returned from gathering eggs to find Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm seated at her kitchen table while Garrett poured coffee. "Faith!" Mrs. Peterson exclaimed, her round face alight with curiosity. "I was just getting acquainted with your Mr. Hayes here." "He's not my Mr. Hayes," Faith corrected automatically, setting down her basket of eggs. "He's the ranch foreman." Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile made Faith's cheeks warm. "Of course, dear. Though I must say, it's a relief to all of us to know you're not managing alone anymore. A woman needs a man's protection out here." Faith bit back a sharp retort. Martha Peterson meant well, despite her outdated notions. "I find Mrs. Sullivan manages quite capably," Garrett said, his tone pleasant but firm. "I'm just here to help with the heavier work." Mrs. Peterson blinked, then recovered. "Well, yes, Faith has always been resourceful. Still, it's not proper for a young woman. I'm hardly young, Martha." Faith interrupted with a forced laugh. At 32, with the hard years she'd endured, young was the last word she'd used to describe herself. "Nonsense," Garrett said, surprising both women. "You've barely begun." There was something in his gaze as it rested on Faith that made her feel suddenly self-conscious, aware of the tendrils of hair escaping her bun, the smudge of dirt on her apron, the sun-induced freckles across her nose that Thomas had always disliked. Mrs. Peterson stayed for another half hour, barely disguising her assessment of the situation between Faith and her foreman. When she finally left, Faith groaned in frustration. "By tomorrow, half the county will believe we're involved," she said, collapsing into a chair. Garrett leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Would that be so terrible?" The question hung in the air between them. Faith looked up, startled. "I didn't mean," Garrett began, then stopped. "That came out wrong. I only meant that people will talk regardless. Best not to fret over it." "Of course," Faith said quickly, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "You're right." An awkward silence fell. Garrett cleared his throat. "I should check on that new heifer. She looked close to calving this morning." He left, and Faith remained at the table, her thoughts in turmoil. Had she misunderstood his meaning? Or had he truly been suggesting? But no. A man like Garrett Hayes, competent, handsome, kind, surely wouldn't look twice at a worn-out widow with a failing ranch. The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. That evening, Garrett didn't join her for supper, sending word that he was staying with the heifer who had indeed gone into labor. Faith brought food to the smaller corral where he kept vigil, finding him crouched beside the struggling animal. "How is she?" Faith asked, setting down the plate and cup. "First calf," Garrett said, his focus on the heifer. "She's having a hard time, but making progress." Faith knelt beside him, observing the laboring animal. "Can I help?" He glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Most women wouldn't want to." "I'm not most women," Faith replied simply. "And I've helped birth calves before." A smile tugged at his lips. "No, you certainly aren't." He nodded toward a bucket of clean water. "You could wash up and be ready to help pull if needed." They worked together as twilight deepened into night. The heifer struggled, but eventually the calf's front hooves appeared, then its nose. When it became clear the animal needed assistance, Garrett and Faith positioned themselves to help, their hands working in tandem to gently guide the newborn into the world. The calf emerged in a rush, slick and seemingly lifeless. Garrett immediately cleared its nostrils and mouth, while Faith rubbed its chest vigorously with straw. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the calf gave a shuddering breath and blinked, its large eyes confused but alive. "There we go," Garrett murmured, gently guiding the wobbling newborn toward its mother. "Good job, little one." Faith watched as the heifer sniffed her calf, then began licking it clean with long strokes of her tongue. The simple miracle of birth, of new life emerging against the odds, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Garrett noticed. "Faith? Are you all right?" She nodded, brushing the tears away with the back of her hand. "Just tired. And happy for her." They watched the mother and calf for a few more minutes, ensuring the newborn found its way to nurse. When they finally left the corral, the night had turned cool, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Montana sky. "Thank you for your help," Garrett said as they walked back toward the house. "You have a gentle touch with animals. They're easier than people sometimes," Faith admitted. "Less judgment." Garrett chuckled. "True enough." They had reached the porch steps when Faith stopped suddenly. "I was married for 6 years," she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "We never had children. I sometimes wonder if that's why Thomas seemed disappointed in me toward the end." The admission hung in the night air between them. Faith hadn't spoken this truth aloud to anyone, not even to Thomas himself. Garrett turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "If he blamed you for that, then he was a fool," he said quietly. "Some blessings come, some don't. It's not for us to understand why." Faith swallowed hard. "He wasn't a bad man. Just driven. He had such plans for this place. And you've kept it going against all odds," Garrett said. "That takes more courage than most men possess." His words warmed something long cold within her. Faith found herself looking at his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the small scar near his right eyebrow that she noticed weeks ago and now wondered about. "You should get some rest," Garrett said softly. "It's been a long day." Faith nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the dried blood and straw on her dress, of her hair tumbling loose from its pins. She must look a fright, yet Garrett was looking at her as if she were something precious. "Good night, Garrett," she managed, turning quickly toward the door. "Faith," he called as she reached for the handle. When she looked back, he was still standing where she'd left him, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "You're a remarkable woman. I hope someday you'll see that as clearly as others do." Before she could formulate a response, he turned and walked toward the small room above the kitchen where he slept. Faith stood frozen for a moment, his words echoing in her mind. Remarkable. When was the last time anyone had seen her that way? Thomas had called her capable, practical, even pretty when they first married. But remarkable? Never that. September brought the first hints of autumn to Montana, cooler nights, subtle changes in the quality of light, a certain restlessness in the cattle. It also brought increased activity as they prepared for the upcoming drive. True to his word, Garrett hired 2 experienced hands, Frank Miller, an older man with a grizzled beard and taciturn manner, and Charlie Whitson, barely 20 but skilled with horses and eager to prove himself. The 4 of them worked to round up the scattered herds, count the cattle, and separate those to be driven to market from those Faith would keep to rebuild her stock. The days were long and exhausting, but Faith found herself enjoying the work more than she had in years. There was purpose in it now, hope that had been missing before Garrett's arrival. One evening, as they sat reviewing their progress, Garrett spread a map across the kitchen table. "We'll take the eastern route," he explained, tracing the path with his finger. "It's longer, but there's better water and fewer opportunities for rustlers." Faith nodded, leaning in to study the map. Their shoulders brushed, and she felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach at the contact. These small touches had become more frequent, his hand steadying her elbow as she climbed down from the wagon, their fingers meeting as he passed her tools, the brush of shoulders as they worked side by side. Each time, Faith felt a mixture of guilt and anticipation. Guilt because some part of her still felt it was a betrayal of Thomas's memory to notice another man, and anticipation because Garrett Hayes made her feel alive again in ways she thought were permanently lost to her. "We should reach the railhead in about 10 days, weather permitting," Garrett was saying, oblivious to her distraction. "Then it's a matter of negotiating the best price. You're good at that, I imagine," Faith said, grateful for the return to practical matters. He smiled. "Good enough. Cattle prices are strong this year, which works in our favor. And if we get a fair price, I can pay off the bank loan and have enough to see the ranch through winter," Faith said, allowing herself to hope. "With some left over," Garrett added. "You could consider hiring a permanent hand or two. Make things easier on yourself." Faith looked up at him, the unspoken question in her eyes. Would he be one of those hands? Would he stay beyond the drive? Before she could find the courage to ask directly, a commotion outside drew their attention. Charlie burst through the door, his young face flushed with excitement. "Rustlers!" he exclaimed. Mr. Miller spotted them moving about 20 head toward the north ridge. Garrett was on his feet instantly. "How many men?" "3 that he could see." "Get the rifles," Garrett instructed Faith as he reached for his gun belt. "Charlie, saddle my horse and yours. We'll head them off at the Ridge Pass." Faith moved quickly to the cabinet where she kept the firearms. "I'm coming with you," she said, checking that Thomas's old Winchester was loaded. "Faith," Garrett began. "My cattle, my fight," she said firmly. "Besides, 3 against 2 are poor odds." A flicker of admiration crossed his face. 4 against 3 are better," he conceded. "But you stay behind me, understand?" They rode hard through the gathering dusk, following Frank Miller's trail. The North Ridge was rocky terrain, difficult to navigate in daylight, treacherous at night. But it was the quickest route off Faith's property for anyone driving stolen cattle. They found Miller waiting behind an outcropping of rocks, his horse tethered nearby. "They've stopped to rest the cattle," he reported in a low voice. "Camp's just beyond that bend. 3 men, like I thought. Armed, but not expecting trouble." Garrett nodded, formulating a plan. "Charlie, circle around to the east. Frank, take the west. Faith and I will approach from here. Wait for my signal, 2 shots in the air. Our goal is to recover the cattle without bloodshed if possible." The men nodded and melted away into the darkness. Faith's heart hammered in her chest as she and Garrett crept forward. She'd faced down rustlers with Thomas once before, but that had been years ago, and they'd managed to scare them off without confrontation. The rustlers' camp came into view, a small fire, 3 men lounging around it, the stolen cattle milling nervously nearby. Even in the dim light, Faith recognized the Sullivan brand on the nearest steer. "Ready?" Garrett whispered. Faith nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. Garrett fired twice into the air. The sound cracked through the night, sending the rustlers scrambling for their weapons. Before they could organize a defense, Charlie and Frank emerged from their positions, rifles trained on the camp. "Drop your weapons," Garrett called out, stepping into the firelight with Faith beside him. "You're surrounded." 2 of the rustlers immediately raised their hands, but the third, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, swung his pistol toward Garrett. Faith didn't think. She fired, the Winchester's report deafening in the night air. Her bullet struck the ground at the rustler's feet, sending dirt spraying upward. The man froze, then slowly lowered his weapon. "That's better," Garrett said calmly, though Faith could see the tension in his stance. "Now you boys have something that doesn't belong to you. We didn't know they was claimed stock." The oldest rustler tried, his voice wheedling. "No harm meant. The brand says otherwise." Faith spoke up, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sullivan cattle are clearly marked." The 3 men exchanged glances, realizing they were well and truly caught. Under Garrett's direction, they were disarmed and bound. "Charlie, you and Frank drive the cattle back to the home pasture," Garrett instructed. Faith and I will deliver these gentlemen to the sheriff in Broken Creek. The journey to town was tense but uneventful. The rustlers, facing prison time, remained sullenly quiet. Sheriff Wilson was roused from his bed to receive the prisoners, and after taking statements from Faith and Garrett, he promised to hold the men for trial. "You did good work tonight," he told them as they prepared to leave. "But be careful. These types often have friends who might come looking for payback." Dawn was breaking as Faith and Garrett rode home, both exhausted but satisfied with the night's outcome. The eastern sky was ablaze with color, painting the land in hues of gold and rose. "You're quite a shot," Garrett commented as they rode side by side. "What did you learn?" "My father taught me the basics before he died. Thomas insisted I practice regularly." Faith smiled at the memory. "He said a woman alone on the frontier needed to defend herself." "He was right about that," Garrett agreed. "Though I hope you never need to use those skills again." They crested a rise, and their ranch came into view below the house, the newly rebuilt barn, the pastures where their recovered cattle would now be grazing safely. "It's beautiful," Faith murmured, seeing her home through new eyes, not as a burden she struggled to maintain, but as something precious, worth fighting for. Garrett reined his horse to a stop beside hers. "Yes," he said softly. "Beautiful." When Faith turned to him, she found he wasn't looking at the ranch at all. He was looking at her, his expression open and unguarded in the early morning light. "Garrett," she began, not sure what she meant to say, only knowing that something had shifted between them during the long night. Before she could continue, he leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her a gentle, questioning touch that nevertheless sent heat coursing through her veins. Faith froze for an instant, then found herself responding, her lips softening under his. When they broke apart, Faith was trembling. I can't," she whispered. Garrett straightened, regret and understanding mingling in his expression. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed." "It's not that," Faith said quickly. "It's just. It's been so long, and I never thought. I never expected to feel this way again." Hope flickered in his eyes. "How do you feel, Faith?" She struggled to find the words. "Alive," she said finally. "You make me feel alive again. And that frightens me, because what if I lose that feeling once more? What if you leave after the cattle drive, and I'm alone again, but this time knowing what I'm missing?" Garrett reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I have no intention of leaving unless you ask me to go," he said simply. "I've wandered long enough. Found what I was looking for when I wasn't even searching." Faith looked down at their joined hands. "How can you be sure? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you're strong and stubborn and kind. I know you love this land as much as I do. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up everything around you." Faith felt tears gathering. "Thomas has been gone 2 years, but sometimes it feels like I died with him. The woman I was before is still there," Garrett finished gently. "Just waiting to be remembered." They rode the rest of the way home in silence, both aware that something profound had changed between them. As they unsaddled their horses in the cool dimness of the barn, Faith found herself studying Garrett openly, the breadth of his shoulders as he lifted the heavy saddle, the careful way he tended to his mount, the grace of his movements. "Garrett," she said as they finished their tasks, Would you kiss me again?" He turned to her, surprise giving way to tenderness. "Are you sure?" Faith nodded, her heart pounding as he stepped closer. This time when his lips met hers, she was ready, her arms lifting to encircle his neck as his hands settled at her waist. The kiss deepened, awakening sensations Faith had forgotten she could feel: desire, longing, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "We should stop," he murmured, though his hands remained at her waist. "Before I forget myself entirely." Faith nodded, though part of her wanted nothing more than to continue, to lose herself in the feeling of being wanted, desired. But he was right. This was too new, too precious to rush. I need time, she whispered. To be sure. You have it, he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead before stepping back. All the time you need. The final weeks before the cattle drive passed in a blur of activity. By unspoken agreement, Faith and Garrett maintained a certain distance during daylight hours, mindful of the presence of Frank and Charlie. But in the evenings, after the others had retired to the bunkhouse, they would often sit together on the porch, talking quietly as the stars emerged. Faith learned that Garrett had fought for the Union, rising to the rank of captain before a minor wound sent him home just months before the war's end. He returned to Missouri to find his family farm destroyed, his parents dead from typhoid, his younger brother killed at Vicksburg. For a long time, I was angry, he confessed one night, his voice low in the darkness. At God, at fate, at myself for not being there when they needed me. What changed? Faith asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. Time. Distance. Meeting people who'd suffered worse and still found reasons to be kind. He squeezed her fingers gently. And eventually I realized that living with bitterness was dishonoring their memory. My mother especially, she always found joy even in hard times. Faith thought about her own grief, how it had consumed her after Thomas died. I think I forgot how to find joy, she admitted. It seemed disloyal somehow. To be happy when he was gone. Do you think that's what he would have wanted for you? To stop living? Faith considered this. No, she said finally. Thomas was many things, but he wasn't cruel. He would have wanted me to carry on. Not just carry on, Garrett said softly. To thrive. The night before they were to begin the cattle drive, Faith found herself restless. The house was quiet, the preparations complete. Tomorrow, they would set out with nearly 200 head of cattle on a journey that would determine the future of her ranch. Unable to sleep, she lit a lamp and made her way downstairs, intending to review their route one final time. To her surprise, she found Garrett already at the kitchen table, the map spread before him. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, setting her lamp beside his. He looked up, his face cast in warm golden light. Wanted to make sure I hadn't overlooked anything. Faith smiled, touched by his thoroughness. We've been over it a dozen times. The route is solid. I know. He leaned back in his chair. I suppose I'm just nervous? She supplied when he hesitated. Cautious, he amended with a small smile. There's a lot riding on this drive. Faith nodded, understanding all too well. My entire future, she said softly. Our future, Garrett corrected gently. When she looked up, startled, he continued. If you'll have me, Faith. I'm not a wealthy man, but I'm a hard worker. I can help you make this ranch everything Thomas dreamed it could be. Faith felt her heart swell with emotion. Are you proposing? Inelegantly, it seems, he said with a self-deprecating smile. I had planned something more romantic than a midnight conversation over cattle routes. Faith laughed, joy bubbling up unexpectedly. I don't need romance, she said. Just honesty. Then honestly, Faith Sullivan, I love you. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. I love your strength, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you face each challenge head on. I love watching you with the animals, seeing how gentle you are despite all the hardship you've endured. Faith's eyes filled with tears. I never thought I would hear those words again, she whispered. Never thought I would feel this way. And how do you feel? Garrett asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Like I've been half alive these past 2 years, and only now am I waking up. Faith reached across the table to take his hand. I love you too, Garrett. It happened so gradually I didn't recognize it at first, but now I can't imagine my life without you in it. He rose from his chair, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then increasingly urgent as Faith responded with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. I should go, Garrett said, his voice rough. "Before I forget myself entirely." Faith shook her head, a newfound boldness surging through her. "Stay," she whispered, taking his hand. "Stay with me tonight." His eyes darkened. "Faith, are you certain? We could wait until after the drive, do things properly." "I've waited long enough," she said simply. "Life is too uncertain to waste a single moment of happiness." Garrett studied her face, seeking any sign of doubt. Finding none, he nodded, allowing her to lead him upstairs to her bedroom, the room that had once been hers and Thomas's, but which now, she realized, held few memories of her first husband. Like her heart, it had gradually emptied itself, making space for something new. In the soft lamplight, they came together with a tenderness that soon gave way to passion. Faith rediscovered parts of herself she'd thought lost forever, her capacity for desire, for abandon, for complete surrender to feeling. Garrett's hands and lips explored her body with reverent care, as though mapping territory both precious and new. Later, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Faith rested her head on Garrett's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I never thought I could be happy again," she murmured. "After Thomas died, it seemed like that part of my life was over." Garrett's fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "Grief has a way of convincing us that joy is gone forever," he said. "But it's just waiting, sometimes for years, until we're ready to recognize it again." Faith propped herself up on one elbow to look at his face in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. "When did you know?" she asked. "That you felt something for me?" He smiled, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "The day I arrived, if I'm being completely honest. You stood on that porch looking like you were ready to face down an army single-handed, even with your barn still smoking behind you." His expression grew more serious. "But I think I knew I loved you the night we delivered that calf together. Watching you fight for that little life, seeing how much you cared. I couldn't help but love you." Faith blinked back tears. "And I was such a mess that night. Covered in straw and worse." "You were beautiful," he said simply. "You're always beautiful to me, Faith. Not despite your strength and determination, but because of it." She lowered her head to kiss him, overwhelmed by the gift of being truly seen, truly known by someone who valued all of her, not just the parts that conformed to what a woman should be. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered against his lips, "whatever comes after this moment was worth everything." The cattle drive began at dawn the next day. Faith rode alongside Garrett at the head of the herd, while Frank took the right flank and Charlie the left. The weather held fair, with clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for moving cattle. Faith had worried that their new relationship might distract from the work at hand, but if anything, she and Garrett functioned even more seamlessly as a team. They communicated with glances and brief gestures, anticipating each other's needs and movements. The first 3 days passed without incident. The cattle moved at a steady pace, grazing as they went. Nights were spent taking turns watching the herd, grabbing sleep when possible. On the 4th day, they encountered their first real challenge, a swollen creek that had not been mentioned on their maps. The recent rains had transformed what should have been an easy crossing into a potential hazard. "We'll have to find another way around," Faith said, surveying the rushing water. Garrett shook his head. "Going around would add 2 days to our journey. We need to get these cattle to market on schedule." They scouted upstream and found a narrower section where the current was less fierce. Working together, they guided the herd across in small groups. Faith held her breath as the cattle plunged into the water, sighing in relief as each one made it safely to the other side. When the last animal had crossed, Garrett turned to her with a grin. "You're a natural at this, you know." Faith laughed, exhilarated by their success. "Don't sound so surprised." "Not surprised," he corrected. "Just impressed. Most experienced drovers would have been more anxious with a crossing like that." Pride warmed her at his praise. Thomas had rarely complimented her abilities, taking her competence for granted while focusing on her shortcomings. The remainder of the journey continued without major incident, though the work was exhausting. By the time they reached the railhead at Fort Benton, Faith was saddle-sore and bone-weary, but filled with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. The cattle broker, a portly man named Henderson, raised his eyebrows when Faith introduced herself as the owner. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, giving her a skeptical once-over. "Your husband not with you?" "My husband passed 2 years ago," Faith replied evenly. "I own the Sullivan Ranch now." Henderson looked to Garrett, clearly expecting him to take over the negotiations. To his credit, Garrett simply nodded toward Faith. "Mrs. Sullivan knows her stock better than anyone. You'd do well to deal directly with her." Surprise flickered across Henderson's face, followed by grudging respect. "Very well. Let's discuss terms." Faith had done her research. She knew current market prices and stood firm when Henderson tried to lowball his offer. After 30 minutes of back and forth, they struck a deal that exceeded her expectations. "You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Sullivan," Henderson said as they shook hands. "Your husband taught you well." "Actually," Faith replied with a small smile, "he didn't. I learned on my own." As they left Henderson's office, Garrett took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice warm with pride. "I think poor Henderson didn't know what hit him." Faith laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. The payment for the cattle would more than cover her bank loan, with enough left over to see the ranch through winter and make some much-needed improvements. More importantly, she'd proven to herself and others that she was capable of running her business successfully. "What now?" she asked as they walked through the bustling town. "Now," Garrett said, "we celebrate. I believe I promised Frank and Charlie a proper meal and a night in town as reward for their hard work. After that," he looked down at her, his eyes softening. "After that we go home." Home. The word held new meaning now, not just a place she struggled to maintain, but a future she looked forward to building. With Garrett. They spent the night in Fort Benton, Faith taking a room at the hotel while the men enjoyed their well-earned celebration. The following morning, they began the journey back to Broken Creek, traveling light and making good time without the cattle to manage. They stopped at the bank first thing upon their return. Mr. Pemberton's eyes widened at the sight of Faith counting out enough money to pay her loan in full, with interest. "Well," he said, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "This is unexpected, Mrs. Sullivan. Most fortuitous." "Not unexpected, Mr. Pemberton," Faith corrected. "Exactly as I promised. The Sullivan Ranch is now free and clear." "Indeed." He cleared his throat. "Should you require any banking services in the future, I'll consider my options carefully," Faith finished with a sweet smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The memory of his condescension was still too fresh. As they left the bank, Garrett chuckled. "I believe you've made an impression on Mr. Pemberton." "Good," Faith said firmly. "Perhaps next time he'll think twice before assuming a woman can't manage her own affairs." They paid Frank and Charlie their wages, with a bonus for their excellent work, then watched as the two men headed for the saloon to enjoy their earnings. Finally alone, Faith and Garrett rode home in companionable silence, both lost in thought about the future that stretched before them. The ranch looked different somehow as they approached, fresher, full of possibility rather than burden. The new barn gleamed in the afternoon sun, the cattle in the home pasture looked fat and content, and even the old house seemed to welcome them back. "I was thinking," Garrett said as they unsaddled their horses, "the south pasture would be perfect for breeding stock. If we invest some of the profits in quality bulls, we could improve the bloodline significantly." Faith smiled at his use of "we." How natural it sounded, how right. "I was thinking the same thing," she admitted. "And perhaps we could add a room to the house. It's a bit small for a family." Garrett looked up sharply, hope dawning in his eyes. "A family?" Faith felt her cheeks warm. "Well, I'm not getting any younger, but the doctor in town says there's no reason we couldn't. That is, if you wanted." He crossed to her in 2 long strides, gathering her in his arms. Nothing would make me happier, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Nothing. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Broken Creek. Mrs. Peterson cried openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. The Reverend Miller spoke of new beginnings and second chances, words that resonated deeply with both bride and groom. Faith wore a new dress of pale blue silk, her one extravagance from the cattle sale profits. When Garrett saw her walking down the aisle toward him, his eyes shone with such love and admiration that Faith felt beautiful for the first time in years. "You are radiant," he whispered as she reached his side. After the ceremony, they hosted a modest celebration at the ranch. Neighbors brought food and drink, musicians played, and for the first time, Faith's home rang with laughter and joy. As twilight fell, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. "Happy?" Garrett asked as they stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Faith leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "For so long after Thomas died, I felt like half a person. Like the best parts of me were buried with him. And now?" Garrett's arm tightened around her waist. "Now I feel whole again," she said simply. "But different than before. Stronger, maybe. More my own person." He turned her to face him, his expression serious. "You know I don't expect you to be anyone but yourself, Faith. I fell in love with you, not some idea of what a wife should be." Faith reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man had come into her life when she least expected it, bringing light and hope back into her world. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I love you." As they stepped into their home now, truly Faith felt the last shadows of her grief fall away. She would always honor Thomas's memory, always be grateful for the life they'd built together. But now she understood that loving again didn't diminish what came before it honored it, by proving that the heart's capacity for love was boundless, ever renewing. In the years that followed, the Sullivan Hayes Ranch prospered beyond Faith's wildest dreams. They expanded their holdings, improved their cattle stock, and built a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. Their family grew as well. A year after their marriage, Faith gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Garrett's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, Michael Thomas, honoring both Garrett's brother and Faith's first husband. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Garrett surprised Faith with a gift, a carved wooden sign to hang at the entrance to their property. It read, "Sullivan Hayes Ranch, EST 1878. "You kept his name," Faith said, touched by the gesture. "He was part of building this place," Garrett said simply. "Part of making you the woman I fell in love with. We honor that." Faith looked out over their land, the fertile pastures, the thriving herd, the expanded house now filled with children's laughter. All of it had seemed impossible when she stood alone on this very spot, watching her barn burn and holding a foreclosure notice. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Stopping here that day? Taking on a widow with a failing ranch?" Garrett's laugh was warm as he pulled her into his arms. "Faith Hayes, that was the luckiest day of my life. I rode in looking for temporary work and found everything I never knew I was searching for." As his lips met hers in a kiss still charged with passion after all these years, Faith silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought this man to her door. She had once believed that her chance for love had come and gone, that no man could ever see past her widowhood to the woman beneath. She had never been more grateful to be proven wrong. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Faith whispered, "You made me feel beautiful again, when I thought that part of me was gone forever." Garrett's fingers traced the familiar contours of her face. "You were always beautiful," he said softly. "You just needed someone to remind you." Faith smiled in the darkness, her heart full. From widow to beloved wife, from struggling rancher to successful businesswoman, from lonely survivor to the center of a thriving family, her journey had been one of rediscovery, of learning that life's greatest blessings often arrive when all hope seems lost. And as she drifted to sleep in the arms of the man who had helped her find herself again, Faith knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of her story were still being written, one day at a time, in this wild and beautiful land they both loved so well.